coming up.
So, Ms. Pullman, would you agree that this is not true as well for small businesses in Canada, that they are in fact losing money with the carbon tax, and that in fact they are owed money by this federal government, and that these cuts to the carbon tax should not be implemented because of the $22 billion that's already been collected, the $2.5 billion that was promised back to them, which is yet to be received? Can you comment on that, please, Ms. Pullman?
I do understand that the government stated that it gives back a portion of the carbon tax funds to small and medium-sized businesses. But as my colleague pointed out, I think your organization recently blew the whistle on the federal government, stating that they had failed to return what she identified as $2.5 billion.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to all of our witnesses for being here today. I see a lot of friends on the witness stand here today, and so it's a pleasure to have all of you with me. I'm looking at a March 22nd, 2023 article, which indicates that small business had paid at that time a total of $22 billion, that's not an M, that's a B, in federal carbon tax. Now I'm looking at a February 20th, 24 article, which indicates that the federal government scaled back their carbon tax rebates for small business. And in fact, that the federal government owed small businesses $2.5 billion in promised carbon tax revenues, which as of this date and this article have not been returned to small business. Now, I recognize, Ms. Pullman, your organization estimates that small businesses contribute as much as 40% of the government's overall carbon price revenue, even though data from your organization indicates that 52% of small firms oppose carbon pricing, and that as a result of this carbon pricing, they're being forced to raise prices for consumers. And over 4 in 10, 45%, said it will increase pressure on them to freeze, cut salaries and wages, something that supposedly parties within this room would like to see maintained or improved. And over 40% say they will have to reduce investment in their businesses. Now, we know that this government likes to perpetuate the lie that the carbon tax is even carbon neutral, never mind that families are losing funds as a result of this carbon tax, as was evidenced by the testimony of the parliamentary budget officer who gave testimony to this committee to that effect. So, Ms. Pullman, would you agree that this is not true as well for small businesses in Canada, that they are in fact losing money with the carbon tax, and that in fact they are owed money by this federal government, and that these cuts to the carbon tax should not be implemented because of the $22 billion that's already been collected, the $2.5 billion that was promised back to them, which is yet to be received? Can you comment on that, please, Ms. Pullman?
Yes, certainly. I think we've been very vocal about the fact that the $2.5 billion that's been sitting with government since 2019 is owed back to small businesses, and it is only a fraction. That's based on about 8 or 9% of the total revenues coming in. And as you stated, our calculations are it's closer to 40% of the revenues that come from small businesses that make up carbon revenues in the provinces in which it exists. And we believe that they've just lowered the amount that they're going to provide to small businesses from 9 to 5% and sort of giving it to other groups for a variety of reasons. So yeah, it's become a real drag for many small business owners right now who are feeling the pinch and not feeling that they're necessarily being considered when it comes to the carbon tax, though they pay a lot of it. So we're hoping to see some movement on that shortly.
Indeed. I think a real drag is an understatement. I'm very proud to come from a small business family, and I know the stress around the dinner table if the store has had a bad day, and I can't imagine the stress of the carbon tax and all these millions of Canadians. We know this government has not been a friend to small business. For example, the 2017 tax changes they made an attempt to implement. This is just another example of that. Mr. Ricco, you said in your opening statement that according to the SME Regulatory Compliance Cost Report, the total regulatory compliance cost to small businesses was nearly $5 billion in 2011, which at the time was approximately $3,500 per business. Would you have any idea how much of this would have been carbon tax related?
I don't have any idea, Ms. Kuzi, but what I can say about those compliance costs is that that's because there's different requirements and different processes in different jurisdictions, and the fact that a lot of our members who are SMEs that takes them over a year or two just to be able to get a permit. That creates a hindrance to be able to do business. And so from our perspective, like that ties into the fact that we're not getting things built done in Canada. And if we're not getting things built done in Canada, then we're not spurring economic growth. And from our standpoint, I think that requires what I tied it to my earlier remarks, is that we need ambition in order to drive economic growth. Ambition without action, from our perspective, leads to empty economic promises, and we won't reverse our investment trends. So if you look at, we're the second worst in the OECD in terms of business investment. We're almost near the bottom in terms of research and development spending. That all adds into the fact that if we don't have a proper level playing field for businesses to succeed, we won't be able to reduce the cost of doing business and supporting innovation.
Mr. Greer, do you have any comments to add on behalf of manufacturers and exporters relative to the effect of the carbon tax on the people you represent, please?
I would just add that manufacturers are generally facing a very high cost, high pressure environment at the moment, and it's cumulative. So it is certainly tax, as we're discussing here today, regulatory burden and all of the costs identified and maybe not captured in federal processes. There's certainly the issue of incentives for manufacturing investment and the pressures coming from the U.S. through the Inflation Reduction Act, not to mention that inflation also impacts all of the inputs that manufacturers required to produce products. So it's a very challenging environment for manufacturers, and it's really all of those factors that are driving anxiety among the industrial sector.
Mr. Swans, anything to add as my time comes to a close in 15 seconds?
Thank you. I think the piece on the carbon tax is to ensure that Canadian companies have a competitive footing in a world, right, in a global economy. Not all jurisdictions have such a tax. How are Canadians being equally treated in a global economy? And that's really one of the big pieces around regulations that impact trade. How do we justify an internal regulation that makes us uncompetitive on the global stage?
Indeed.
You just heard from one of the apostles of the do-nothing conservatives on climate change. The Conservatives are holding up Bill C-59 at committee, delaying, obstructing, holding up this vital piece of legislation that contains the ITCs. Can you tell us what that delay and Conservative obstruction is costing and risking Canadian manufacturers?
So we've been long and will continue to urge swift implementation of all ITC-related measures, both legislative and in the guidance side. So the government just finished some consultations on a lot of the guidance for some of the ITCs, and that rests with ISED and other relevant departments in finance. So yes, we 100% encourage swift adoption of all legislative measures to implement the ITCs, but equally we're also very concerned that the guidance and implementation information that's needed so that investments can start being made have not been made public yet.
Through you, Chair, I will be directing the first of my questions to Ms. Pullman, and then perhaps I will be able to have other witnesses weigh in on some of the issues that we're talking about here today. I did have the opportunity to meet with representatives from the CFIB earlier this spring. I have 360 members in my riding. I represent a large rural riding in Saskatchewan. And I did go back and look at the slide deck that they gave me, and I note that, probably reflective of a poll that was conducted in January, 71% of your members highlighted that taxes and regulatory costs were the largest cost to small and medium-sized businesses. And I think that's something that we really need to pay attention to. Obviously, over the past 8 years, we've seen a steep increase in the cost of living for Canadians. And we've heard from small businesses that they are not immune, that they too have been struggling due to the rising price of everything, which is partially, we know, maybe in many ways being driven by the rising carbon tax. I do understand that the government stated that it gives back a portion of the carbon tax funds to small and medium-sized businesses. But as my colleague pointed out, I think your organization recently blew the whistle on the federal government, stating that they had failed to return what she identified as $2.5 billion of these funds to the businesses that you represent. And this includes $300 million to businesses in my province of Saskatchewan. Wow. And that is something that I think has been identified not only by your organization, perhaps even by members through their chambers of commerce, but certainly by businesses themselves through emails that I have received. And many have had to close their doors as a result of not only the pandemic, but then the rising costs that are being imposed on them. Can you tell me, if you're aware, has the government reached out to your organization or even to members of your organization in regards to returning these funds to small and medium-sized businesses?
Well, obviously, we've been actively engaged on this for quite a while, so we have been in touch with both the elected official side as well as the civil service side to sort of encourage ways to return that money, and certainly providing suggestions as how that could be done. I think it's important to reiterate something that you said earlier as well, which is that corporate bankruptcies are up over 130% year over year in Canada. We see more businesses closing than opening. We've had that 3 months in a row, which is unheard of in Canada. They need this help right now. So anything we can do to get that money back to those businesses, I think will be very helpful. And I just want to make sure, and this has been our messaging, and we have been speaking to government, so there have been outreach. We have had those conversations. But we also want to make sure that any of that money that gets returned is not returned to just a distinct group of businesses or even larger businesses, that it's kind of given back to almost as many businesses as possible, because all of them have had to pay. And so I think it's important that that is a key component of whatever happens. We're very hopeful, but we have to just wait and see. And we're continuing to, of course, use our members and their influence to also encourage governments to return that money in those 8 provinces that are affected.
Thank you very much. The $300 million that is owed to Saskatchewan businesses works out to about $7,000 for each small business. What sort of, if you don't mind speculating, what sort of difference would this make to these businesses, particularly when the operating costs are so high due to many of, I would say, this government's disastrous policies? Have businesses come to you and articulated what difference getting this money back would make for them?
I think having a few $1,000s may not seem like much to a lot of people, but to a very small business, that can really help them get through the next 2 or 3 weeks. So it's going to be an important amount. Keep in mind, the CEBA deadline just passed, the Canada Emergency Business Account deadline just passed, and we know that about 25% of them had to get a loan in order to repay it, and that another 6-8% couldn't pay it back. So they're also dealing with that. So having a little bit of money to help them pay with the debt that many of them are under is going to be really important. And I'm personally very worried about the fact that so many businesses are making decisions right now to close their business. So any little bit at this point is going to help. So we're really trying to encourage that money to be returned as soon as possible.
Unfortunately, a portion of the public service is in the unfortunate position again. We saw a great failure with the public service negotiations maybe 18 months ago, leading to actually strikes and protests outside this very house. We have now again a CBSA strike vote in the next month due to a lack of a contract within the CBSA for 2 years. So I'd like to ask you, Mr. Swans, please, is the strike vote causing uncertainty for importers and exporters?
Yes, it is. And I think the biggest uncertainty is around the timing. The strike may occur at the same time as the CBSA is starting to implement a major new software program called CARM, or the CBSA's Assessment and Revenue Management Software Program. This program has been subject to a number of hearings at the CIIT committee. and there was a motion tabled yesterday at that committee around this. A strike could be quite concerning if it happened at the same time, because we're unsure what the result of that software will be because it's frankly untested.
Thank you. Mr. Greer, would you like to add anything to that, please, on behalf of manufacturers and exporters?
No, just to echo, the timing is of concern to us and our members for the same reasons that Mr. Swan outlined.
Thank you. Ms. Pullman, I see on your website you are encouraging the government to pass private members bill, Bill C-234 in an effort to provide further carbon tax relief for Canadians. Could you speak a little bit about that, please, about your organization's encouragement of the passing of Bill C-234? Thank you.
Sure. C-234 is the bill that will reduce carbon pricing for certain types of farm activities. And there is already a reduction in carbon pricing for farms in certain capacities, but this is to touch on some of the other elements that the farm uses energy for that weren't a part of the exemption on the carbon pricing in the first place, such as heating barns and other such types of activities. And we have had anecdotal information from some of our ag members that they've seen their carbon pricing go up quite dramatically, having a huge impact on things like, how they can operate their business and how they sell their goods. So we are hoping that C-234 in its original form will be able to go through, but we know that there are amendments already being placed on it, which is dampening down what was the original piece. We would love to see the original version pass through the House.
Right, in its original form. Thank you very much for adding that. And finally, Mr. Rico, I'm sure you, as many Canadians, have been following the Arrive scam scandal, the issue which has seized not only this committee, but Parliament and also Canadians. Can you tell us about the discussion about the way that this shows government to conduct business? Is there any discussion, feedback, conversation within your membership as to this scandal? And what would be their reaction and their commentary regarding it? If business were to be done in a way that we have seen the Arrive scandal unfold?
Well, I think overall, for business to be done properly, just broadly speaking, it has to be done openly and transparently. And I think when you're looking at procurement processes, there has to be able to be clear guidelines in general. And I think right now, if departments don't talk to each other, if there's not an ability for that transparency to happen, then it makes it difficult to do business. I think every business has a budget. Everybody has to follow guidelines. Everybody has to be able to follow rules. And if you're overspent, it's also a challenge as well, right? So there has to be a balanced approach overall from our perspective. And as long, I think when it comes tying back to regulatory reform, if we're transparent, if we're coordinated and we're aligned, then I think it can lead to better outcomes, not only for businesses, but also for Canadians as well.
In your opinion, does the current Canadian procurement system serve Canadian businesses?
I think there's procurement reform is required. I think from our perspective, I think if we look at what we tie into even advanced research and commercialization and innovation projects, if we look what has been done in the United States with the U.S. DARPA agency, I think they've been the model in terms of what happens with procurement. I think that ties into the fact that there needs to be fair and open procurement practices, and that's something we've called for at the chamber. I think there's a long way to go. I think that has to tie into be able to encourage more domestic manufacturing, especially when we're competing with our largest trading partners, but also to ensure that we're producing the best goods and services possible for Canadians.
Thank you, witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We were speaking about the one-for-one rule earlier in the Red Tape Reduction Act. And I guess I have a couple of questions for any one of you that would like to answer it. In your experience, have you found that the government generally abides by this rule? We'll start with Mr. Greer.
Sure. The short answer is by the letter of the rule and the law, yes. It does require a cost analysis, the standard cost model that Ms. Pullman referenced earlier. And then over a 2-year period, you have to reconcile costs in and costs out. So how it's written, yes, but how it's written is too narrow. There are all sorts of legislative changes, guidance, and other rules that the rule doesn't apply to. So you can still abide by the one-for-one rule, which the government is, and still have a significant increase in regulatory burden. And I think I said off the top, the administrative burden baseline, the number of regulations that impose a burden on businesses has increased from 130,000 in 2014 to 149,000 as of 2022. So we're still seeing, despite that rule, a growth in administrative burden requirements.
Thank you very much. I was going to ask, and perhaps you've already answered it, but maybe I'll just see if I've understood you correctly. So do you know of any jurisdictions that have had successful regulatory modernization initiatives, and perhaps what lessons or best practices from those jurisdictions we could adopt? A really quick answer.
Ms. Pullman referenced British Columbia. They actually set out to reduce the overall burdens on business and then maintain it. So I think that would be a worthy goal at the federal level, to reduce and maintain.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn my time over to Mr. Genuous.
Thank you, Chair. I found the testimony very interesting today. Thank you all for being here. I do have a motion that I want to move. It's on notice regarding Indigenous procurement, though, and I hope we'll be able to come to some kind of a consensus on that quickly. So that it is the motion I put on notice regarding the creation of a subcommittee to study the issue of Indigenous procurement. Members had it and are familiar with it and can look at it. For those that were not following us on Monday, just to quickly review, this is a motion that would involve us doing a study through a subcommittee on Indigenous procurement, specifically on government operations and Indigenous reconciliation, looking at some of the issues and potential problems with the Indigenous procurement system. I'd like to make a few comments first on substance and then on process. First of all, Indigenous procurement is extremely important to us, and I hope to all parliamentarians, creating jobs and opportunity, supporting the development of Indigenous businesses, and ensuring that Indigenous communities across this country benefit is something that's very valuable and very important. Through our study of Arrive Can, we've seen that there have clearly been what appear to be abuses. That is, companies that are tiny companies that are not seeking to provide benefit to Indigenous peoples in a broader way are simply receiving contracts and then subcontracting to non-Indigenous businesses. I believe that this is contrary to the purpose of the program, and that getting to the bottom of what happened, recommended changes, is an important way to seek to restore credibility and confidence in the process. This is an issue that is separate and distinct from the Arrive Can issue, although there's obviously a link, and I think it involves looking at both procurement issues and policies of Indigenous affairs. Why am I proposing a subcommittee? I see this as being a policy area kind of at the nexus of what would be INAN's mandate and what would be OGGO's mandate. I know that both committees are very busy. There are other studies that members have wanted to do at this committee, and INAN frequently receives government legislation. Both committees are very busy. I think a subcommittee that brings together people with specific expertise in both of those areas would be the most effective way of doing it. It could be time limited in its operations, but I think it's important. We don't want to crowd out other priorities. We want to make sure there's a forum that can get this done. I do want to work towards having a motion that can succeed on this. Very much open to amendments. I understand Ms. Vignola may have an amendment that I'm very much disposed to. I hope we can have a conversation that leads to us being able to undertake this work in a collaborative way. It's important work. We want to be able to restore confidence in the Indigenous contracting system and ensure that we have a procurement system that is delivering real benefit to Indigenous peoples across Canada and is not being hijacked by well-connected insiders who know how to work the system but are not providing those real benefits. That's why I put forward this motion today, Chair, and I'm very open to some amendments. I expect we'll see some, and we'll have a good discussion about those. Thank you.